Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters. I'm a therapist who's been in practice for 25 years, and I've been working with thousands of patients to help them lower their stress, be less anxious, more happy, and healthier. And so this video is part 3 of the Shame and Guilt series. Okay, so this video is part 3 of a 3-part series on shame and guilt. And if you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, I will put a link to 1 up here as well as 2, depending on which you haven't seen. So go watch both 1 and 2 and then come back and watch this one, and it will make more sense. So in parts 1 and 2, I talked about how to have a basic understanding of shame and guilt, and also how to understand how they can become toxic. And so in this part, I want to talk a little bit about some features of the paths to detoxifying toxic shame and guilt if and when they exist in your life. So as I said, just as a very brief recap, shame and guilt are normal. They're common parts of human emotional lives, and they are sometimes constructive. So sometimes they're not a big problem because they can be constructive to the extent that they inform our lives to help us be in the world the way we want to be in the world and to act in accordance with our values and goals. However, they can become very toxic, and it's a common reason that people go to therapy. And often one of the central reasons that people present in therapy because they're struggling with shame and guilt, or situations that have high risks of inducing toxic shame and guilt, or they're working with, interpersonally with a family member or partner who has toxic shame and guilt. So it's a common issue in therapy. And by the way, I don't mean for my videos on this channel to replace good therapy when that's exactly what you need. These videos are to be an adjunct to all of our paths to happiness, and they can be supportive and help you alongside therapy when needed. But if you need therapy or you're not sure if you need therapy, talk to a therapist about that. I'm obviously biased in that advice because I'm a therapist, but therapy helps a lot of people. If your sink is broke, you're going to call a plumber. And if you have trouble with shame and guilt, who you're going to call a therapist, right? So you don't take my videos as a replacement for good care, for direct care. But what I want to talk about today are just some of the features of working with shame and guilt so that you can become more healthy and understand that there are paths to detoxifying toxic shame and guilt. And I think that there are some specific things that appropriately apply effectively to shame and guilt, given how I understand them. And I've, again, explained that in the last 2 videos. So one thing that is essential for detoxifying toxic shame and guilt is having good awareness of your shame and guilt. And obviously, they may sound on the superficial level like a stupid statement. Of course, John, I'm aware, right? This is why I'm watching the video in the first place. Are you a dumbass or what? I can see that reaction happening with some of you. But I'm not just saying have some awareness. What I mean is having sufficient awareness. And one of the things about any aspect of our lives, including our emotional lives, is when we have chronic misery, our brains naturally don't want to be focusing on that fully in an open way, unfiltered, all day, every day. That compounds the misery. And I talk about this in my other videos. I talk about this in my practice. Chronic stress loads up on us because we don't get enough breaks from it. Our brain is naturally wired to take breaks from chronic stress. So a chronic emotional misery is one where naturally we are going to diminish our level of awareness of it a decent part of the time, just from the standpoint of not being more miserable than we have to be. But part of the cost of that is diminished awareness. And I'm not saying that that's an argument for, again, unfiltered open awareness with no breaks, because I preach over and over how breaks are essential for surviving and tolerating misery, but it does have the effect of to diminish it. So when we're going to work with something as complicated as toxic shame and guilt, we're going to have to take a look at it. Again, this is part of the argument for going to therapy, because we therapists support people in safely and effectively taking looks at challenging aspects of lives. Another avenue for awareness that works for a lot of people is journaling, and there are lots of different ways to journal in a therapeutic sense. You can Google therapeutic journal and things like that and find lots of examples of things that people suggest about that. So journaling is another avenue for that. Now, related to awareness, and I think facilitative of awareness, is being able to access a state of acceptance and being able to improve your capacity to be in a state of acceptance. And I'm going to make another video where I talk about acceptance / equanimity, different term for same thing, versus apathy. But I want to make clear, I'm not talking about apathy, meaning just let down your guard and whatever. I'm not going to contend with anything. I'm not going to filter anything, and I'm going to let anything in. Acceptance is an active engagement in an experience while also staying stable. So keeping your stable base and not being battered around too much by the turbulence, and yet being able to stay meaningfully engaged and oriented towards something. So that's acceptance. It may be something we're trying to change, which again is why it's not apathy. But acceptance means I'm going to sit with this thing in order to be with it, in a way that's conducive of my highest good. And so, therapy again is a way to bolster the ability to be in a state of acceptance, because adding another careful shepherd, steward, guide, support is often a way to safely look at things that are challenging to look at, difficult to look at. So therapy is a way to have acceptance. I've talked about this in other videos, and I will keep talking about this too. Mindfulness practices are also a way to both be in a state of acceptance, but also to develop your capacity to be in a state of acceptance. And what I mean by that in terms of the state versus the capacity, if I go and I run so that my heart has better cardiovascular fitness, what I'm wanting to increase is the capacity of my cardiovascular fitness, because maybe I want to go run a marathon or something. So capacity matters more than just the state in any given moment. So we want to be able to be in a state of acceptance, let's say in a therapy session or while journaling, but it helps us even more if we increase our capacity to be in a state of acceptance. The best way to do that I know after decades of looking at this issue is to practice mindfulness. Mindfulness actually not only helps us be in a state of acceptance, but it actually increases our capacity to be in a state of acceptance if we regularly practice. So if you're interested in that, go check out videos on this channel that I've made about how to practice mindful breathing and the explanations of why mindfulness helps, and you can get some instruction on that. So another issue in terms of detoxifying toxic shame and guilt is differentiating healthy regret and remorse from shame. And I talked in the last video about how there's guilt, which is the intellectual idea I did something wrong and it caused a risk or a consequence to myself or someone else. And then the associated emotional response, which either is shame if we have cognitive distortions associated with the guilt, or remorse and regret if it's more specific and healthy guilt. And that's going to have the emotional quality of sadness, right? If it's regret and remorse. And so, our overall goal with all of this, in my mind, is not to eradicate shame and guilt, or else we'd lose the ability to have empathy and to guide ourselves in the world. We'd be narcissists. So some shame and guilt is constructive and healthy in our lives. Too much shame and toxic shame is going to be diminishing of our lives. And one way to learn how to participate in appropriate shame and guilt is to examine the role of regret and remorse in your life, in terms of, when is it appropriate to be sad about something that happened? And that leads us toward compassion toward the self, and it leads us toward forgiveness, and it leads us toward a more healthy processing of guilt and unmet expectations and violated expectations, as opposed to getting into the realm of toxic shame. So regret and remorse. Another one is to look at whether or not shame and guilt are showing up in places where it is incongruent with your emotional life. So in the last video, one of the things I talked about was when like a super avoider transmutes frustration into shame and guilt in order to avoid conflict. That's an example of shame and guilt showing up in an emotional regulation process where it is actually an incongruent element as opposed to congruent. And so part of what we therapists do when we're working with someone around shame and guilt is, of course, ask them all sorts of questions so that we can understand how they're experiencing it and reacting to it. But part of what we're listening to is it showing up in some moments where it's incongruent or disproportionate to that moment? In the context of any given moment, in general, our emotional responses and our cognitions you could judge them as being relatively congruent with what's happening, or lining up well, or not being incongruent, and being proportionate, meaning a little thing causes a little reaction and a big thing causes a big reaction. That's proportionality. Or disproportionate, So if you see a time where a little thing causes a really big reaction, that's a clue that there's some miswiring going on in terms of the cognitive or emotional regulation related to how that particular type of trigger gets processed. So that's another thing to examine with shame and guilt, although that's also a general thing to examine with lots of different aspects of emotional regulation if you're trying to improve your overall emotional intelligence and your capacity to handle emotions well, right? Another one is work on forgiveness. And I'm not going to go too deeply into the concept of forgiveness in this video or to be too long. I'm going to make another video just on forgiveness and talk about that soon. But with shame, sometimes we need to consider forgiving our former self or forgiving someone else. And with guilt, same thing. We sometimes need to consider forgiveness. But suffice it to say, if we just kind of reduce all of what I would want to say about forgiveness into a short bit here in the interest of time, forgiveness has to do with moving on, not necessarily having that mythical closure where the thing no longer affects us, but where we move forward in time. We move beyond the experience in our life while the thing is diminished because it moves behind us in our timeline. It moves into our past while we move forward. We call that emotional relocation of an event. So forgiveness in part includes emotionally relocating the thing, allowing it to kind of stick in one place in our timeline. And basically, you can think about it this way. If we achieve forgiveness to some degree, then we stop having that experience where it's like the thing is happening all over again. It's like the thing never stopped happening. It's like it's happening now as fresh as it happened right when it first happened. So when someone says that kind of thing, it doesn't mean they necessarily have to forgive, but forgiveness is not happening if someone today is experiencing the event from the past as though it just happened fresh, right? So forgiveness has to do with not pulling along with you a troubling event, but finding a way to let it kind of stick in its one place in chronological time while you move forward in chronological time and thus gain some progressively increased distance between you and that event. So that's all I want to say about forgiveness right now. But as I said, I'm going to come back around and spend a whole video or more on the concept of forgiveness later. And then related to that is the concept of atonement. So when someone has guilt that is causing ongoing misery for whatever reason and by whatever process, cognitively and emotionally, there are times where atonement is a very appropriate thing to consider. And atonement meaning that you take some action or actions in order to basically morally, personally, psychically, spiritually pay something to the universe or to someone or yourself. You are making amends to rectify the past wrong that you feel partially or wholly responsible for. So that's what atonement means. And, I may make a whole video on atonement as well, because that's kind of a rich topic. But I will say the best and the healthiest atonement occurs when it needs to, if the person is approaching it from a rational standpoint and not only an emotional standpoint. So let me give you an example. So I was a mediator for 10 years in addition to being a therapist. I used to mediate mostly civil mediations and divorces. And one day I was standing somewhere talking to a lawyer who was also a mediator, and we were chatting shop talk about mediation in different ways. And one of the things that the lawyer said to me was, you know what? I love it when I get to represent in mediation as the lawyer, not the mediator. So when he's the lawyer in a mediation process representing a party in a mediation, he said, I love it when I'm representing a divorcing person whose soon-to-be ex had an affair on them. Because a lot of the time, the person who had the affair at the time of the divorce is full of all sorts of remorse. And because they're full of all sorts of remorse, they try to atone for it by giving away the farm, basically. So he's saying, if I'm representing the other party, I'm going to win everything we ask for in the mediation, because the other person feels guilty and shameful and full of all that toxic level of shame. And they're going to give away the farm in order to, in an attempt to atone for it. And my response to that lawyer there, and the reason I bring this up as an example here in this video, is that is emotional atonement, and it's unwise. And the reason it's unwise is I said to the lawyer, so that person is going to give away everything. And does the money matter? Maybe, maybe not. But what if the other parent asks for a certain parenting time schedule, and the person who's full of shame because they had an affair also doesn't assert themselves appropriately for their position as a parent who needs appropriate parenting of their shared child? That means that they may enter into an unwise agreement based on this emotional response of just wanting to say, yeah, you can have everything you want, and I'm not going to assert any resistance to that in any way. They're abdicating the responsibility to themselves, to their child, and to everybody in that situation by just taking an ultra-passive position in order to have an emotional attempt at atonement. And the lawyer didn't agree with me, but I don't care. That's still my position today, just like it was during that conversation. Unwise attempts at atonement don't lead to good outcomes. And so if you have confusion about atonement, again, this is a really good time to talk carefully with a therapist. Not that we can judge, yes, you should do this, no, you should not do that. But we certainly help people in talking through perceptions, thoughts, expectations, feelings in ways that probably do support people in making wiser decisions, sometimes about really complicated and consequential kinds of decisions. So can atonement be a really great choice for lasting toxic guilt? Certainly. Should you think really carefully before you proceed to try to enact some action of atonement? Absolutely. Because if you're, to the extent you're coming at it from either an unclear state or an unwise state or an emotional state, you may do something that doesn't work the way you want it to, or has an unintended effect that's negative, that you don't like. So that's what I want to say about atonement. So in this video, I wanted to lay out just some of the features of the paths toward detoxifying toxic shame and guilt. There are others, right? But I think that those are some that are often central to the healing process. And just to reiterate, I think that there's a lot of value because of the level of consequence, the level of consequence, and how complicated toxic shame and guilt are. There's a lot of value to getting good therapeutic support, because it's part of what we do. We guide people in the process of all these different parts of being in a state of acceptance enough to be sufficiently aware of the parts that you need to be aware of in order to work with them in the healthiest way to get the best outcomes, right? So that's what we do. So consider talking with a therapist if this is seeming outrageously complicated for you or overwhelming. However, as I said, there are lots of adjuncts that I think, like journaling And I think, you know, practicing mindfulness is going to work well for you even when you're not in therapy. So that's a good one to work with even before you find the therapist that you might eventually decide that you want to work with. All right. So if you like this kind of content, feel very free to hit the like button below. Feel free to comment because comments help shape what I do on this channel, and share it widely if you find this helpful and think you have a friend who might like to know about it. And I'm happy to have you as a subscriber too, if you'd like to be apprised of upcoming videos that I'm going to publish in the future. So thanks for joining me today, and I will see you soon.